This is an ABC podcast.
When I was pregnant, the dads would come and take my two kids to the park or the movies for a couple of hours to give me a break. But then you throw COVID in the mix, those sorts of things basically don't happen.
The experience of being a surrogate in a COVID era. Also, the onset of dementia can be a particularly isolating experience for the whole family, but there are efforts to change that.
It's just great to talk to other people, get their experiences and think, oh, okay, so you're not on your own. This is what people are going through.
And why are medical students on the cashless debit card?
I wasn't able to save. I wasn't able to allocate the money and do all the things that I've set up earlier.
I'm Hilary Smale. Welcome to Australia Wide. The Australian timber industry has experienced a hectic few weeks. Just last week, the Master Builders Association called for an urgent national plan to grow more plantation timber, with Australia facing a shortage of 250,000 house frames in the next 15 years. Meanwhile, in New South Wales, a parliamentary inquiry is looking into the long-term sustainability and future of the timber and forest products industry. And in Western Australia, the industry is reeling after the state government announced a ban on the logging of native forests from 2024. So what's the future of the timber industry in Australia? Simon Dorries is the CEO of Responsible Wood. They certify whether or not forests are being sustainably managed in Australia. Simon, welcome to Australia Wide. Just firstly, so we're all on the same page, can you explain the difference between plantation timber and native timber forests?
First of all, plantations tend to be forests that are planted by people, oftentimes on lands that were former agricultural lands. Trees tend to be planted in rows, and oftentimes they are exotic species. So species that come from the Northern Hemisphere, such as radiata pine or slash pine or Caribbean pine. On the other hand, native forests are forests that grow naturally. Usually they are naturally regenerated. Sometimes there's some assisted planting, but again, that will be usually through seeding of seed and not planted in rows as such.
What challenges are governments facing at the moment when it comes to the future of some of these forests? What kind of pressures are they under?
Look, governments are facing a variety of challenges. First one comes from the conservation movement. There's a lot of discussions around putting more of the timber production forests into permanent conservation reserves. But also there's the impacts of the fires. So that, again, has been quite catastrophic in certain parts of the country. And also there's the challenges around timber supply. So, the building industry has unprecedented demand. A lot of that demand originates from Australian native forests.
So can you tell us a bit more about that, Simon, and why there is such a shortage of timber at the moment for the building industry?
The greatest shortage is around pine framing timber. There's a variety of reasons. The first reason is, first of all, just demand has never been so strong. The government introduced their stimulus package for the building sectors. That was incredibly successful. That drove demand to probably in my lifetime, probably has never been as strong. But that's also combined with disrupted international supply chains. So, Australia supplies roughly 2/3 of its construction timbers. The other 1/3 is imported from overseas. So places like Europe, Canada, North America, and so there's been some real disruptions. COVID, obviously, with manufacturing sites being shut down. But more importantly and more recently, it's just the unprecedented costs of freight and the unavailability of shipping containers, which makes it very difficult to get product from the Northern Hemisphere to Australia.
You mentioned earlier that sustainability and the conservation movement is having quite an effect on the industry at the moment. Can you explain the effect that customers are directly having on, the decisions that state governments are making in terms of the future of timber?
Look, so you mentioned customers. So I'd say generally most people absolutely love timber. and they want to have a beautiful Australian native forest floor or, something like a piece of beautiful furniture. So I think one of the challenges is sustainability tends to be poorly understood. The fact is that Australian native forests are incredibly well managed. They're managed to best practice standards, but obviously the conservation movement, they've got a very clear policy that they would like to see all native forests shifted from timber production to put into permanent conservation reserves. The fact is that with sustainability or good sustainable management, you can have both good conservation outcomes, but also supply timber sustainably for building of houses and making of high quality furniture.
Can you give us an example of that? So, for instance, there might be endangered animals or birds in a particular, native forest that people are concerned about, that if logging is taking place and they're obviously being disturbed, how can you sustainably manage both of those competing interests in that instance?
Oh, look, absolutely. So, look, under the Australian Standard for Sustainable Forest Management, the forest manager has to assess what significant biodiversity values are in their forest. And once they're identified, they will protect them. So put them into a conservation area or a conservation reserve, or they'll protect areas of significant biodiversity, such as around streams and river courses. Once they're identified, they'll be protected, or sometimes they'll be managed. So there'll be a scientifically based management plan in place to ensure that those populations are disturbed as little as possible. And the fact is, when you look at the science, some of the rare and unique and endangered species are absolutely thriving in sustainably managed Australian forests.
Simon, what approach is needed, in your view, to keep the timber industry sustainable but also ongoing here in Australia in the years to come?
A lot of the shortages come down to the size of our plantation estate. So there is great opportunities to increase the area of, for example, pine plantations or even native timber plantations, as to provide a sustainable long-term timber source. Now that obviously can be a little bit challenging for government. Sometimes that conflicts with the agricultural sector. They have concerns sometimes that good quality productive farmland could be locked up in timber production. But that's not always the case. And there's also the private native forest estate. So there's great opportunities there. If farmers, for example, and the agricultural sector could manage their native forests on their lands more effectively and improve forest health and also productivity, that could be an ongoing sustainable source of timber supply.
And what will happen if these avenues aren't explored by government and the industry isn't supported to sort of change with the times, as it were, Simon?
Look, I don't think the demand for timber is ever going to reduce. People love timber. It is, probably by far the most sustainable building product. There's no doubt that going into the future that suppliers will look overseas for sources of supply. Oftentimes it could be from countries that don't have the same high quality, robust, sustainable forest management standards in place, and maybe coming from countries that have really poor law enforcement. So again, it's not a good outcome. So it's really about getting the most out of Australian forest, whether it's sustainably managed native forest or increasing the plantation estate.
Simon Dorries, CEO of Responsible Wood, thanks for speaking to Australia Wide.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
You're with Hilary Smale this Tuesday evening. Remember, you can always email us about stories and love to hear your feedback, particularly on that issue. If you have something to say, feel free to send us an email, australiawide.radio@abc.net.au. Employment hubs are the latest offering from the federal government to try and help people on the cashless debit card. The idea is to match people with jobs in their local area, but not everyone is convinced it'll work. Goldfields reporter Sean Tariq Goodwin had a look at the cashless welfare card now 7 years after it started.
Ceduna, East Kimberley, Kalgoorlie, Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. These are the locations where the cashless welfare card is in operation. Trials first began more than 5 years ago.
The cashless debit card has provided practical support for people to stabilise their lives, but now that they are, we want to make sure that we're supporting them into work.
That's Federal Social Services Minister Anne Ruston. She's talking about the announcement of a $30 million pool for organisations in these areas to set up local employment hubs for those on the card. The city of Kalgoorlie-Boulder, in the West Australian goldfields, announced it would be the first to set up one of those hubs.
The hubs that we're announcing and the grant opportunities for people to participate in this are to make sure that the barriers that people may find, the disconnect between people who are unemployed and the work that is obviously out there, we need to work on ways that we can break that down.
Mining billionaire Andrew Twiggy Forrest put forward the concept of the card to the federal government in 2014 as one of the recommendations of the Creating Parity report. Louisa Olney leads the Building Community Initiative at Forrest's philanthropic organisation, the Minderoo Foundation.
We're really pleased to see the grants open for communities to make their applications and think this is a great step in supporting these communities and their participation in the cashless debit card.
She says 5 years into the program, the organisation is hearing positive reports about the card's impact.
The people that we speak to in communities talk to us about the impact it's having on them and their families. Particularly, we hear from women and the role that they play in supporting their families and the impacts for children. In particular, those kids who are able to go to school with having had breakfast and families that have enough for the essentials of life.
She says the grants announced could provide crucial wraparound services for those receiving their benefits through the card.
It's not the only thing that communities need to support. These grants are aimed at greater economic participation, and I think that it's important to appreciate that it's not the silver bullet, but it's a really important part in supporting families and reducing harm for children.
But not everyone agrees that the program is going smoothly. All welfare recipients in locations where the card is operational are placed onto the system. That includes medicine students like Sarah El-Jamil on year-long placements in rural or regional communities.
I used to work maybe 10 to 20 hours a week to support myself prior to moving to Kalgoorlie, but now while we're here, we're on prac full-time hours and we don't get paid for any of it. And then the only way I've been able to support myself is through the Centrelink Youth Allowance.
Sarah says being put on the card feels disempowering, and she imagines that feeling would be even worse for more disadvantaged people.
To be told that, you're studying and you're working full-time hours and then there's this government support, but then at the same time, you're not a valued member of society or something like that.
She says there's been occasions where the system has blocked payments for everyday spending.
You get anxiety sometimes using the card in random places because you're like, is it going to work? Is it going to decline? Are they going to accept the card?
80% of Sarah's youth allowance income goes directly onto the card. She says that's meant she's had to take on credit card debt, which she wouldn't ordinarily do.
I have all this money that I've used up on my credit card and I only get $100 from Centrelink each fortnight to be able to try and pay it off, and there's just all this money sitting in the Indue card. Yeah, it's very stressful.
Devma De Silva is another medicine student in Kalgoorlie. She said that for her, the card has also made budgeting harder, not easier.
I wasn't able to save. I wasn't able to allocate the money and do all the things that I've set up earlier.
Social Services Minister Anne Ruston says those who don't have problematic spending habits can apply to move off the card.
There is a mechanism by which, if you are on the cashless debit card and you can demonstrate that you are managing your life and your finances, that you will be able to exit the card. That is already available to you.
But Sarah El-Jamil says it's not an easy process.
I've tried to go through the process of getting off it, and you have to prove to them that you aren't a criminal and you haven't had criminal charges against you, and you have to write up all the fines that you've gotten ever and whether you've had a restraining order put on you.
Devma De Silva has also tried to get off the card. She agrees that navigating the system is difficult.
I can't imagine how someone who is struggling with other things in their life would cope with that stress.
University of Western Australia finance professor Raymond De Silva Rosa says the creation of employment hubs would be a positive step.
If there's a group of people who don't have jobs and there are jobs available, we could do a bit more work in combining the two. We could find out ways of matching them together rather than simply saying, the people are lazy or there's some other issue there.
But he says the government should have created a more tailored system, as opposed to a blanket approach, which is administratively cheaper to implement.
When you have to proactively identify those who need help, there's a bit more work involved. But I think the extra work involved will be more than offset by the benefits, whereas if you have an opt-out system, then you'll definitely breed resentment and it's less likely to be successful.
Here's Devma again.
the audience that it's captured is such a big audience of people, and if you did a little bit more background research on all these people, you'd probably find like a large proportion of them don't need to be on the Indue card. It's pretty unempowering, really, to be put on this card and be told this is how you can spend your money and stuff when you don't have a problem doing that.
Medical student Devma De Silva speaking to our reporter Sean Tarek Goodwin.
This is ABC Australia Wide.
A surrogate pregnancy is normally a shared experience between the surrogate and intended parents, but COVID is changing that, particularly for families separated by regional borders. Charmaine Allison has the story.
Gazing at her pregnant stomach, feeling the kicks of the baby that wasn't hers, Zara Stratton felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. For 9 months, she'd been carrying a child for another couple, her childhood friend and her husband. It was always supposed to be a shared experience. The intended parents would be there for every scan, to share the joy of each milestone and support her all the way up to the day of birth. But with the couple based in Melbourne and what seemed like a never-ending carousel of COVID lockdowns, Ms. Stratton only saw them 4 times before the baby arrived.
We couldn't FaceTime them for the scans or anything. It does take away a large element of the emotional side of things.
On July 17th, in the depths of yet another lockdown, she finally gave birth to a little girl. And after months of separation, the parents were finally granted an exemption to be by her side.
And I watched this moment where parents got to meet their child for the first time. It was really, really special.
According to Surrogacy Australia support coordinator Anna Mackay, Ms. Stratton is not alone in her experience. In fact, Ms. Mackay said the pandemic had left many surrogates feeling like vessels.
The intended parents never make them feel like that. It's a frustration at a situation. It's not the pregnancy that they had imagined when they started their surrogacy journey.
Ms. Mackay said more surrogates were engaging with ongoing counselling due to the emotional strain of the situation.
We have psychologists who specialise in surrogacy journeys, and so that they can really help them compartmentalise and then helping them try and find ways to still find joy.
A close connection between intended parents and surrogates is vital. Ms. Mackay knows this firsthand. Exactly a year ago, she gave birth to a baby boy for 2 dads.
When I was pregnant, the dads would come and take my 2 kids to the park or the movies for a couple of hours to give me a break, or come and do my grocery shopping. Then you throw COVID in the mix. Those sorts of things basically don't happen.
Surrogacy Australia says most surrogates have little difficulty handing the baby to parents post-birth. That was true for Ms. Stratton.
I got my reward out of watching them hold their baby.
But Ms. Mackay says COVID-19 has made this process feel more transactional for some surrogates.
It might feel then like the only time I'm going to get to see the parents is at the birth when I hand them their baby.
But while the pandemic has presented its challenges, Ms. Stratton said there were some silver linings.
The counselling sessions, I think we had 5 sessions and then a session as a group. Now, it would have been lovely to have done those in person, but they had to be done in Melbourne, and at that point we had the Ring of Steel. It wasn't an option. So they opened up being able to do counselling via Zoom. I think the real positive to ongoing is that it's opened up that door to people who otherwise might have said online, not an option.
Shepparton surrogate Zara Stratton ending that report by Charmaine Allison.
You're listening to ABC Australia Wide on ABC Radio.
Great to have you along. Hilary Smale with you this Tuesday evening. Finally, living with dementia is a tough, often isolating journey for the person diagnosed and their family. But on the Sunshine Coast, a special dementia cafe is making that journey a little easier. Kylie Bartholomew went along to see what it's about.
It's a breezy spring morning and a few dozen friendly faces are having a cuppa and a chat under a rotunda in the Noosa Botanic Gardens. The tea is nice and hot and the ribbon sandwiches are freshly made.
Jeannie has dementia. She's probably around about 5 years in now.
Dick 80 is his wife's full-time carer.
Yes, it's 24/7 and it does really restrict you. There's things that you used to do that you can't do any longer. it's just a matter of accepting that.
The 80s come to the Dementia Cafe every fortnight. It's a chance to talk, laugh, cry and connect with others going through similar experiences.
It's great talking to the other carers. So I've had a talk with Peter this morning and his wife. Probably not quite as advanced as Jeannie, but yeah, it's just great to talk to other people, get their experiences and think, oh, okay, so you're not on your own.
Mrs. Adey says having regular catch-ups with the group has made coping with her diagnosis easier.
We came here and it was like I was a family. This has been the best.
Not-for-profit aged care provider Noosa Care started the Dementia Cafe in 2018. The group recognised that as well as those living with dementia, the wider community also needs support and education. It recently launched the Dementia Friendly Memory Support Pack, a booklet that'll be distributed to businesses, health providers and emergency services, and it includes ways to have hard conversations when there's been a dementia diagnosis. Dana Wood facilitates the Dementia Cafe and says the group took guidance from Dementia Australia to get the booklet just right.
We've got a driving section in the pack, and the change in that is it's gone from having a conversation about taking the driver's licence off someone living with dementia to now having the conversation with someone living with dementia and discussing when are they ready to relinquish their licence. And that's more from an empowerment perspective.
Cafe volunteer Bill Jury says that change in language is important.
There's a lot of stigma with dementia still, and people don't quite understand it. I can see now in our rollout of our new pack that there's word changing has taken place. The stigma and being afraid of it is softening. None of us are protected from this disease.
Mr. Jury's wife, Bobby, also volunteers. She says the regular get-togethers have a big impact on the carers.
The fact that they can interact with someone that's in the same position. I think when you actually can talk to someone that's living that day-to-day and you can bounce off each other. And I think that moving forward, our group's learning a lot from each other. And I think that's important.
Carer Rosa Wergerer cherishes the face-to-face support. Her husband of nearly 64 years, John, has dementia and has been in full-time care for a year.
I really suffered badly to make that decision and I imagine what it will be like when he realises that he can't come home. Whatever I imagined came through and a lot worse. He is really not accepting this well. Not that he doesn't like it in there, he really does. I need probably more support than he does. I still find it difficult. He wants to come home all the time.
For Mrs. Wergerer, she has a ready-made support group where she can talk openly about her concerns and develop friendships.
Even your friends do not understand what it's like to care for a person or to be married to a person like that. They not only lose their memory and their brain functions, they also lose friends because people can't seem to cope. I find it difficult sometimes with John to have a conversation going. You talk about something and in the next second is talking about something completely different. And people find that a bit off-putting, I think. Like when I go out with friends, I try not to talk about it at all because nobody wants to hear this all the time. It's not the most pleasant conversation. That makes it difficult for me to have a social life to a certain extent. But this for me is part of a social life because those people understand.
For Dick and Jeannie Adey, they'll continue to navigate the dementia journey, but they're not alone.
Since I've had the dementia, I cry for days and days. And I couldn't remember anybody and I couldn't do things. And I just cracked up. I just couldn't stand it. And then Dick just soothed me. When you find somebody that not only cares, but wants to stay with you.
Yeah. Just kiss.
That's Jeannie Adey there from the Sunshine Coast, ending that story from Kylie Bartholomew. And that's Australia-wide for this Tuesday. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, you can podcast the show or listen back to the program through the ABC Listen app or by visiting the Australia-wide website. Just search for ABC Australia-wide. We also love to hear your feedback. You can email us through australiawide.radio@abc.net.au. I'm Hilary Smale. I'll be back with you the same time tomorrow. I'll see you then.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.